So I have the privilege today of introducing Maurice Smith, and it really is a privilege because, as Pastor Megan said, if there's an expert in Spokane on homelessness, he's with us today. It's scary, but truly, Maurice, along with his video work of filming and documenting what's happening in Spokane with the homeless community, he's in there working with the people hands-on and giving support, giving love. The things that Pastor Megan talked about in our sermon today, the things that a nice houseplant would need, he's giving to the homeless community. So I won't say much more because our newsletter outlines Maurice's accomplishments very well, and Pastor Megan did too. So we'll just let Maurice tell you what he knows. Welcome.
Thank you. Oh, dear, I have been set on a pedestal. This is scary. Welcome. Thank you for inviting me to share this time with you. 22 years ago, my wife and my family were homeless. We experienced a financial collapse, lost business, lost everything we owned, except what we could stuff into 2 storage units. And we spent the next many years recovering. I know something of the trauma that families go through. Fortunately, by the grace of God and the help of friends and family, we didn't have to sleep in our car. But I can empathize with those who have. That was a life-changing experience. I'm a seminary-trained pastor. I have a master's degree in systematic theology from Denver Seminary years and years and years ago. I was on their adjunct faculty, designed the field education department, taught Greek. I've been there, done that, pastored churches, led a network of house churches. I call myself a recovering evangelical. I believe everything theologically, whether that's you Mike's in systematic theology, which is a brilliant systematic theology book. Tell people, what do you believe? Well, read Wayne Gruden's systematic theology. When you're done, if you have any questions, let me know, and we'll talk about it. What I discovered was I didn't have a clue about what it meant to actually live my faith out in terms of outside of the boundaries that evangelicals can do. Social boundaries, political boundaries, all of us. And so I tell people I'm in recovery. And part of that recovery was rediscovering Matthew chapter 25, 31, 46. And you did it the least of these words. Learning what it means to find Jesus in the face of the homeless, the hungry, the marginalized, the prisoners, the sick, those who are struggling, people living in poverty. We're very much a middle-class church, and there's nothing wrong with being middle class. I'm reminded the fiddler on the roof. It's no great blessing. It's no curse to be poor, but it's no great blessing either. I was raised in a middle class home, and so I enjoy the privileges of that. There's nothing wrong with it until we forget who we are and what it is we have been called to do. And it is to serve others, not so that they can become middle class, but so that they can touch and taste the kingdom of God in a way that we have, hopefully. And we communicate that through unconditional love as we work with those who are struggling. And so that's been my lesson the past 22 years. I've worked among the homeless and the hungry and marginalized for about 17 years. I'm a co-founder of Feed Spokane, which is still around, and rescuing food from area restaurants and putting it into meal sites around the city. Spent over 10 years on the board of Food Ministries Men Shelter, working with them directly. Several years on the leadership team of the Spokane Homeless Coalition, and I'm on the planning committee for Spokane Homeless Connect, which is the largest homeless services fair or event in Eastern Washington. It happens every January. So this year we had to move to March because the COVID out and resurgence. Well, you know all that. Our lives have been scrambled for the past 2 years. So that's a little of my background, who I am. 3 years ago, I started making documentaries. And so I'm still coming to terms with this. I'm a documentary filmmaker on homelessness in Spokane. We've made 6 full-length documentaries, 7 if you count the hidden homeless. We have 2 different versions of it. But at least 6, maybe 7 full-length documentaries, and probably about a dozen what I call documentary short films. Things like homeless camps, the dignity of a shower. That was a great one. We ran, I'll lose track after that one ran 14 minutes. And we sent it out, and I got an email from the other side of the state, somebody in Fullsboro. So we saw your documentary on the dignity of a shower. And we took that and showed it to our board, and it was the impetus that we needed to begin a shower ministry over here in Fullsboro. And I just went, that's my goodness. I want to do 3 things. I want to change the optic of what people see about homelessness. Number 2, I want to, because we live in an age, as one apologist said, so we live in a generation that listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings. What we see is what we hear, and how it makes us feel becomes our truth. And when I heard him say that, I went, wow, he has nailed this generation. That's what we do. We listen with our eyes, and we think with our feelings. And so my question to myself is, how can I take the values of the kingdom of God, values such as shalom, blessed are the shalom makers. Jesus didn't say peacemakers. He didn't speak Greek or English, he spoke Aramaic. And in Aramaic, what the disciples heard Jesus say was, blessed are the shalom makers. And so my question is, how do we build the shalom of the homeless? And the reason we build their shalom is because by doing so, we build our shalom. And so we can't do this apart from each other. And that's been a huge lesson for me. So what we're going to do this morning, I'm going to stop yammering because, change the optic, change the narrative, what's the story of homelessness? And number 3, change the tone. Optic, narrative, and tone. And the tone that I believe as believers that we need to set the tone of building shalom. And shalom has 5 or 6 different meanings depending on the context. It can be peace, welfare, well-being, healing, restoration. It's a very deep, broad, beautiful Hebrew word that does not get explored enough. So what we're going to do this morning, we're going to take 30 minutes and watch the opening 3 segments of The Night of the Unsheltered Homeless. This is a documentary that we filmed last fall and then released in December. And everything that I produce is aired by community-minded television, Comcast Channel 14, and it's also on Roku. That Roku's there. Online, on our YouTube site, this documentary, all of our documentaries have been viewed about 160,000 times, which is amazing. I don't have any friends, so somebody that I don't know who's watching. This documentary, since it was released the 2nd week of December, has been viewed just over 11,000 times. And it's getting some national attention, which I'll talk about later. So let's do that. Let's watch the first half hour of The Night of the Unsheltered Homeless. We'll talk about it, and then I'll take your questions. And I'll hang around afterwards as long as anybody wants to talk. And I love yammering about this stuff. It's what I do. So
you'll be here next Sunday too.
And I'll be here next Sunday.
Yeah.
So you'll come back with all kinds of questions.
For 12 weeks, from the 1st of December 2020 to the end of February 2021, this building, part of City Church Spokane, was a low-barrier homeless shelter, providing warmth, safety, and stability to 35 low-barrier guests every night. During that time, 212 different people spent at least one night in the shelter during the difficult winter months. During that time, 2 shelter guests found permanent housing. 6 guests found transitional homes. 4 guests got jobs. 6 guests went into drug and alcohol treatment. 8 people were reunited with their families. And the shelter provided 32 bus tickets for guests wanting to go home to family in other communities. By any metric, this temporary, privately operated, low-barrier shelter, filled with people often mislabeled as shelter-resistant, was an incredible success and an example of how we as a community can work together to offer practical solutions that build the shalom, the peace and well-being of those experiencing homelessness. How we as a compassionate community can successfully serve and build the shalom of this challenging homeless population is what this documentary is all about. Welcome to the Night of the Unsheltered Homeless. Let's begin our time together with a story about a key. It doesn't look like much, just a useless key to a bike lot that's long gone. The bike and the lot belong to Mr. Green, and that's where I want to begin this story. We called him Mr. Green because when outreach workers from Jules Helping Hands first met him on the street, he had dyed his hair bright green. You can see him in this outreach photo. His real name was Jeremy Hendricks. None of us really know just how long Jeremy had been homeless, but it had been a while. This post on Jeremy's Facebook page sums up Jeremy's world the week before Thanksgiving of 2020. I need a place to live. I'm tired of being homeless. I get SSI $700 and some change. Anybody out there that can help me or get a room for rent, I appreciate it. That makes my Thanksgiving Christmas, and a happy one. I'm tired. I just want to leave this world altogether. It's getting old. Somebody's out there that would be willing to help me with my own room, drug-free. Contrary to popular opinion, people like Jeremy don't enjoy being homeless, and many of them have simply lost hope and have no place to go and nothing to look forward to. The homeless in our community can lose many things and survive, but hope is not one of them. When you lose hope, you begin to die.
Somebody, I can hand Evelyn to you.
I first met Jeremy, or Mr. Green, in this parking lot in January of 2021, when Julie Garcia and I spotted him here surrounded by first responders, who'd been called because someone saw him sleeping in the doorway of this business. I asked Julie if we could go back to that parking lot and talk about that day. Now, when we found him here and pulled into the parking lot, there were paramedics were here, ambulance, and it was escalating. You could kind of tell it wasn't going to end well.
Yeah.
And in fact, we saw the police drive by later, so that would have been the next step. They were in the area. But I noticed the moment you got out of the car and he saw you, he calmed down.
Yeah.
Why? What happened?
We have a relationship.
How important are relationships in working with not just the homeless in general, but people like Mr. Green who have issues? They don't know who to trust.
They're imperative. There's no other way to reach those folks. We can't force them, yelling at them, being nice to them. You have to create trust. And that's what Jules does, is create trust.
Yeah. You know, you talked to him. I loaded his stuff into the car. We took him up to the City Church shelter that we were running at the time. And he maintained there for 3 months, and then went with us to the Women's Club shelter, and he maintained there for about 2 months. Why was he able to maintain so well there and not be able to fit into traditional shelters?
Because it's a mutual respect. He had a respect for us, we had a respect for him. We've been consistent with him throughout the years. When we see him, we help him, we talk with him, we treat him like a human. When we were here that day and I drove past and I saw him, I knew it was going to end badly because I know Mr. Green and the girl that he was with. In all of the time that I've ever taken care of Mr. Green, the day that we took him to City Church, I've never seen him stay or remain sober. And up until the day that he passed, he was still sober. And the last message that I got from Mr. Green was a message through Messenger saying, "I love you guys, see you soon." And I never heard from him again.
In mid-April of 2021, Jeremy tested positive for COVID during a routine weekly COVID test of shelter guests. Before leaving for the Immaculate Heart Isolation Facility, Jeremy came to me and said, "Here's the key to my bike lock. Could you keep it safe for me while I'm gone?" "Sure," I said. "I'll be glad to." Jeremy was taken to the Immaculate Heart Isolation Facility, where he developed full-blown COVID, lapsed into a coma, and died. There was no obituary or public memorial. His death didn't make the newspapers or TV news. We found out secondhand from someone at the isolation facility. That's what happens when you're one of the dal, one of the insignificant poor. The Hebrew Old Testament uses 5 different Hebrew words to describe those we call the poor. Why 5? Well, because poverty has many different expressions, including homelessness. One of those expressions is found in the word dal, the word used to describe the insignificant poor. Scripture doesn't see people as insignificant, but like a brutally honest mirror, it simply reflects and records how we treat them. Amazing how little has changed in 3,000 years. Like the homeless and marginalized of our own day, the dal occupy the lowest strata of society. They don't have wealth or social standing. They don't appear on anyone's social radar, except as people to be avoided, or swept up in a law enforcement sweep of homeless encampments and told to move on. We label them bums or drug addicts to give ourselves emotional permission not to see them, not to care, and to treat them as if, in the greater scheme of things, their lives don't matter, as if they are, in fact, insignificant. We might not verbalize such feelings, but we express them every day by how we treat the homeless and marginalized. People like my friend, Jeremy. After all, how we see people is the beginning of how we treat people. Let's end this story where we started it, with a bike lock key. I keep it on my keychain for several reasons. First, I keep it to remind me of my friend, Jeremy. Second, I keep it as a reminder that the lives of our homeless friends matter. They may be poor and homeless, but they are not insignificant, and they don't deserve to be treated that way. Third, I keep it as a reminder of the importance of low-barrier shelters and shelter beds, operated by service providers who understand trauma-informed care, and the need to build the shalom of our community by demonstrating fearless compassion and unconditional love toward the homeless and marginalized of our city, toward real people like Jeremy. Finally, I keep it as a reminder of the many homeless individuals who, like Jeremy, have died while experiencing homelessness in the shelters and on the streets of our city. This film is dedicated to them and to my friend, Jeremy. As we produce this documentary in mid-2021, several important questions are being tossed around like a political football. What should be a human issue has become a hot political issue, and even a legal issue. Let's look at some of the most common questions. First question, how many people are experiencing homelessness in the shelters and on the streets of our community? Let's begin by setting a couple of benchmarks when it comes to homelessness and shelter beds. Every community receiving federal dollars to combat homelessness is required by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, otherwise known as HUD, to conduct an annual census of their homeless population. It's called the point-in-time count, and it's conducted every year during the last 10 days of January. According to Spokane's 2020 point-in-time count, the last full count before COVID, 1,559 individuals were experiencing homelessness in the shelters and on the streets of our city during the last week of January that year. At this point, you may be thinking that we're exaggerating the number of people experiencing homelessness in Spokane. Actually, our numbers are very conservative. As we were producing this documentary, I received a copy of a report titled Snapshot of Homelessness in Washington State for July 2020, produced by the Washington State Department of Commerce. According to Table 4 of that report, 5,424 individuals were experiencing homelessness in Spokane County in July of 2020, 6 months after the point-in-time count. The report hasn't been updated due to staffing issues, but my guess would be that the numbers from that report are larger today than they were in 2020. Welcome to the river of homelessness that flows through our community. It's deeper and wider than you think. Second question, do we have enough shelter beds for the known and counted homeless population? The short answer is no, we don't. The City of Spokane keeps a shelter capacity tracking report compiled and maintained by the city's Community Housing and Human Services Department. Here it is. According to that capacity report, Spokane's citywide shelter system had a capacity of 805 beds in January of 2020, when the point-in-time count recorded 1,559 people experiencing homelessness. That's a shortfall of 754 beds. That's enough beds for only 52% of the known and counted homeless population. Think of it this way. If every person experiencing homelessness in January of 2020 had shown up at local shelters looking for a bed, 48 out of 100 would have been turned away because there were no beds. Third question, what's the shelter bed capacity today in 2021? A June 13th, 2021 article in the Spokesman Review stated that preliminary data from the January 2021 point-in-time count showed that 992 people were counted in city shelters that month. The City of Spokane used this preliminary data to argue that the citywide shelter capacity was 992 beds. No, it isn't. The annual point-in-time count is always divided into two parts, sheltered and unsheltered. Due to COVID restrictions, the 2021 count did not include the unsheltered part. People not staying in shelters simply were not counted. The remaining sheltered portion of the count is always divided between emergency shelter beds and transitional housing. Historically, the emergency shelter portion of the sheltered count is consistently about 79% of the total, with the transitional housing portion making up the other 21%. For 2021, this would mean 783 shelter beds were filled, not 992. And the city's own capacity report showed 773 total shelter beds in the citywide system at that time. According to the city's own internal numbers, the shelters were full. Do you see the problem? If the shelters were full in January of 2021, where were the unsheltered homeless that did not get counted supposed to go? Because there were no beds. Using the unsheltered numbers from the 2020 count, this would mean 541 unsheltered individuals with no access to a shelter, a bed, or the services those shelters might provide. Getting an accurate count of emergency shelter beds often feels like trying to nail Jell-O to a tree, due in no small part to the city's lack of transparency. As part of this documentary project, our research team directly contacted every shelter in our city and asked them to verify their bed capacity and how many of those beds were low barrier beds. This graphic shows the result of our research. The citywide shelter system has never had more than the 805 emergency shelter beds reported in January of 2020. As this graphic shows, by mid-2021, as we filmed this documentary, that number had fallen to 769 for a net loss of 36 beds. For a city with a known and counted homeless population of 1,559, having only 769 shelter beds presents a problem. The homeless have nowhere to go. Fourth question, are there open shelter beds every night, and why don't the homeless access those beds? A new catchphrase recently entered the discussion surrounding those who refuse to stay in local shelters. They're referred to as shelter resistant. Let me be clear, shelter resistance is a myth. These are people who, like my friend Jeremy, simply cannot maintain in a traditional shelter. And the reasons run much deeper than a catchphrase, much deeper issues than the number of available beds. The reality is that we don't have the right kinds of shelter beds.
And I do want to push back against this myth, urban legend out there that the people who are not in shelters don't want to be sheltered. That is just completely untrue, and the numbers don't bear that out. The shelters that we had last year, we had 2 shelters that were low barrier, 24/7 co-ed shelters. They were full every night. They were totally full, and when we closed one of those shelters this summer, which we shouldn't have done, but when we did, the city did it, those people went back to living on the streets. We knew they liked shelters. There are some people that might not want to go to a particular shelter if the rules are too harsh, or it might be a particular religion, or it's really a drug treatment center and they're not either appropriate for drug treatment or they're not ready. There are occasions like that, but for the most part, people who are living in the cold and the heat, if you gave them low barrier shelter that worked for their psychological and mental health needs, they would take us up on it, and they do regularly.
I sat down with Dr. Samuel Murray to explore his thoughts on issues of trauma and shelter resistance.
One of the symptom clusters is avoidance. You know, that's in the definition of the illness, that a person would avoid stimuli that would recreate the emotions or the physical sensations of the original trauma or the stacked traumas on top of each other. And so, you know, if I think about people who grew up in poverty, in homes where there was people coming and going all the time, where there might have been someone selling or using drugs out of the home, where there was unpredictable violence, where a lot of noise coming out of the parents' bedroom meant there was a fight, right? And you go to a shelter environment where a lot of that's, you know, shelters can be quiet places, shelters can be calm places. There's lots of really, really good shelters. But even in the best of circumstances, shelters are dynamic places. There's a lot going on. And that amount of stimuli for a person who has that past experience, to me, it makes sense that it would be avoided. It might be for a person, an individual person, it might feel safer to go sleep unsheltered on a park bench and be at risk of frostbite than to go into a situation where they know they're going to be on edge, they're going to be hypervigilant, they're going to be waiting for something bad to happen, they're not going to get any rest, and they're likely to feel worse.
For the street homeless, the issues keeping them out of shelters involve such things as deep personal trauma, including trauma experienced in shelters, mental health, like Jeremy, medical respite issues, substance abuse, concerns about personal safety, especially among homeless women. I've personally spoken with women who have recounted their experiences of being sexually exploited by shelter staff. There's more, but hopefully we get the point. By the way, these are some of the same issues which prevent the homeless and marginalized from accessing city-sponsored cooling and warming centers. The popular myth of shelter resistance exposes the glaring lack of the right kinds of shelter beds. But there's more.
I have a background in clinical psychology, education, and training. And one of the things I learned really early on from one of my mentors was this rule that everyone's behavior makes sense once you get all the information. Even things that seem inexplicable to us on the surface can be explained once you know everything that's factoring into that behavior. It could be something as dramatic as they live in a different reality because they have delusions or hallucinations. Schizophrenia, for instance. You might see someone running down the street yelling in terror with nothing behind them, which makes no sense to you, but when you learn more about that person, they may actually see a bear chasing them, and so it actually makes perfect sense for them. And when you understand that someone has trauma in their history, or an addiction, or mental illness, or poverty, or any number of factors that make sense to them when you get to know it, then you can start solving the problem.
So, are you a vet?
Absolutely.
Have you got any?
Killed at sea, actually. I died in the Navy, and they brought me back to life.
Have you gotten any? What you're seeing in this video is a homeless veteran with severe PTSD and mental health issues, whom I filmed and interviewed with his permission under a bridge one winter's evening in January of 2021. A police sweep may move him out from under the bridge, as it did the following week, but there are no shelter beds for him that will meet his mental health needs. 100 empty shelter beds in a dozen traditional shelters won't address his challenges. Where is he supposed to go? And there are many more like him in the subterranean river of homelessness that flows through our city. Where are they supposed to go when traditional barrier shelters simply won't work? One of the answers to this question is the availability of low barrier shelters where the shelter resistant can rebuild lost trust, find safety, stability, and a path forward. And that brings us to our next question. What is a low barrier shelter, and why does it matter? And do they even work? Recently, federal courts have increasingly ruled in favor of the homeless based on the lack of adequate shelter beds, preventing cities from enforcing municipal no camping or sit and lie ordinances when there are insufficient low barrier beds to accommodate the unsheltered homeless.
I think the Martin versus Boise decision illustrates really well the limited power of the courts and what their power actually is. It was considered a major blow for homelessness rights and people who advocate for the homeless to get finally a court victory that said there's a limit on what the city can do. But it's important to remember a few things. It was rare. It was got so much attention because it's not often that plaintiffs win cases like that. It was vigorously opposed. There were a number of dissents that were some of the most strongly worded dissents I've ever read in my career as a lawyer, to saying how wrong the court was to do this. And so judges aren't of one mind to do what was done in Martin v. Boise. And then it was very limited in scope within itself. It held only that it violates the 8th Amendment for the police to arrest somebody for being on the streets if there are no homeless shelter beds available. But of course that leaves a lot of other options available to the police. So when there are homeless beds available, they can still arrest people. And it only says that you can't criminalize the existence of somebody as a poor person, a homeless or unhoused person. But it left open the option of police to still arrest people for conduct crimes, such as obstructing the sidewalk or other things that aren't based on their existence. And so police have been able to get around a lot of the Martin versus Boise spirit by doing that. The power was not in what the court ordered, it's how the public responded to the court's decision. The media gave it a lot of attention, and then people gave it a lot of attention as community members, speaking up at city council meetings and writing into their politicians and marching and demanding that, hey, this is a problem if we're arresting people. And the decision itself made Boise change during the litigation. It changes policies to say we're not going to enforce the sit and lie law while shelters are full, and it admitted in the litigation that arrest should be the last resort, and it's prompted Boise and other cities around the country to start thinking about investing more in shelters and housing and low barriers to getting the housing.
The city of Spokane has publicly acknowledged that it doesn't have the low barrier day shelter space required by the courts to enforce its own no camping or sit and lie ordinances. So yes, low barrier shelters matter when it comes to community homeless policy and practice. So let's go back to the whole idea of low barrier shelters versus barriered shelters, and why low barrier shelters are so important for folks like Mr. Green.
Well, how else are you going to get them in off the street? We have high barrier shelters and they're great and they work, but somebody in Mr. Green's condition can't meet those barriers whether he wants to or not. He's not mentally able. His addiction isn't going to get him to maintain long enough, and nobody just quits drugs to go into a shelter. That's just not the way that it works.
On a personal note, I've been directly involved in operating 4 low barrier shelters, 3 of them during a pandemic and under less than ideal conditions. I'm not an expert, but I do play one in documentaries. Low barrier shelters accept anyone regardless of their condition or level of need, and without any requirements for admission or participation. These shelters serve this most vulnerable population as a backstop when everything else has failed. When traditional shelters aren't an option, when everyone else has given up, when the struggling homeless have lost hope and have nowhere else to go to restart their journey back to stability. Low barrier 24/7 shelters can offer not only a safe bed for the night, but a place to spend the day, access services, get food, use a restroom, take a shower, do laundry, securely store their belongings, and even receive medical care when needed. A low barrier shelter can offer stability and a friendly starting point for a new journey out of homelessness, as it did for my friend, Amanda. I met Amanda when she came to stay at the City Church Low Barrier Shelter in late November of 2020. Her stay at the City Church Shelter became the end of a long journey through abuse, trauma, drugs, and homelessness, and the beginning of a new journey into a new life. I asked Amanda to join me back at the City Church Madison building where we met. So let's talk about the fact that we're back in the old shelter at City Church. Looks a lot different from the last time you and I were here, doesn't it?
Completely. Oh yeah. Everything's different. The desks no longer there, the beds, the food, the tables.
Your bed was just about where you're standing, right?
Yeah.
Up against the wall there.
Yep.
Let's talk about, where were you before you came here?
I was in a homeless camp in Meade. There was a bunch of us, and it was hard out there. Like, I love the people from there. I could never go back because it's drugs and people living lives that I don't like. Like, they steal just to make money, just to be able to do things, you know, and I couldn't even do it. Like, everyone's like, well, why don't you come with me? I couldn't even go scrap with them because it was still stealing from somebody else, you know. So
You wound up there, you were fleeing domestic violence.
yes.
Because you'd been homeless for a while, and you'd been using drugs for a while. How long had that been going on?
The domestic violence was, well, off and on since, well, more on than anything, since 2011 actually. And then the drugs started in 2018, in June of 18.
And then somebody from Jules Helping Hands was doing outreach out there, and that's when you heard about the City Church Shelter, is that right?
Yeah, I was handed 4 sandwiches, some socks, and a bus pass with the address on it, and I was told that the shelter, it was its first day, it was opening day, and if I wanted a bed, they'd save me a bed, and I said yes. And I came that very day. Like, I didn't look back.
You told me once that you'd only been sober, clean for about 4 days when you got here.
Yeah. Yeah, I was clean for 4 days. My clean date is November 27th, officially, because I had done drugs the day before, but no drugs as of November 27th.
How did life here in the shelter impact you? What changed you? You are a very different person than the Amanda I met back in November. What happened?
Oh, people caring. I have never experienced anything like I have ever since Jules came into my life. I had people that cared and wanted me to succeed, and they were doing anything and everything they could possible to give me that comfort, that help, that guidance, that everything to be able to keep my life and get off the drugs, get off the streets, and to better my situation.
And other people kind of stepped up too. I know eventually you went to stay with Pastor Jason and his family from City Church right next door here. This is their building. And they basically adopted Amanda and took you into their family.
Yeah, I mean, the night they asked me if I wanted to live with them, I thought I was going over for dinner. Jason goes, well, you want to come over for dinner one night? I said, yeah. So I'm thinking I'm going over to their house just to eat dinner. Well, after we ate dinner, they asked me at the end of it if I wanted to move in because the Spirit was telling them, God was telling them to have me live with them. And so I said yes. I mean, I cried like a baby, but now I have my own room because of them. And I have a home, I have a safe place and a family, and I'm involved in the church. And Jason and I keep talking about this building and where I came from and how God saved me in City Church and Jules Helping Hands. Because if it wasn't for everybody involved, I would probably be dead right now.
Something has profoundly changed in the man.
Yes, it has. And it's Jules, it's the shelter.
Well, let's talk about that. The importance of a low barrier shelter, which is what this was back in November of 2020 when you came here. How important is it for folks like yourself or others in homeless camps who've not been in shelters for a while to have access to a low barrier shelter? I mean, look what it did for you.
It is beyond important. I would always said I would never go to a shelter because of things that have happened growing up and prior at shelters, you know. But having access to a low barrier shelter it's vital. It literally is in our survival of homeless as well as drugs, any drug addict and homeless, because without it, we're afraid to do anything. We're afraid to go to a shelter because who knows what's going to happen, whether they're going to call the police and we're going to get arrested, or if there's going to be a problem, you know. But having it to where you can come because somebody cares and they don't care about who you are or what you've done, they just care about helping you and continuously helping you. There is nothing more important than that. And that is exactly why I am where I'm at today, because of the people that care and because Jules in the low barrier shelter, because I had the opportunity to come and not be judged, not be ridiculed, nothing, just have a place to lay my head on a bed every single night for 2.5 months. I was fed, I was clothed, I had endless amounts of clothes. I didn't even know what to do with it because people care, because I had access to the low barrier shelter. And I have climbed out of everything because I've had that access and I've had those people. And if it wasn't for the low barrier shelter, I promise you, I would still be on the streets if not dead right now.
One surefire way to not solve a problem is to underestimate its size and to make your plans accordingly. Any plan created on such bad data will be smaller than the problem we're trying to solve and will doom us to eventual program failure. We do ourselves, the homeless, and our larger community no favors by underestimating the size of our homeless population and by offering inadequate one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter shelters that don't address the needs that keep people out of shelters. That's why accurate numbers matter and why current regional plans to address homelessness are all but guaranteed to fail. The plan continues to be smaller than the problem. Homelessness is much bigger than regional policymakers are willing to acknowledge. Those of us who attempt to speak truth to power often feel like the little boy in Hans Christian Andersen's The Emperor's New Clothes. Not the feedback the emperor wanted during his unveiling. As for the homeless on the streets and in the parks of our community, they aren't going to mystically disappear like some urban homeless version of brigadoons simply because we choose not to accurately count them or provide adequate and appropriate alternatives for them. We'll never build the shalom, the peace and well-being of our community and the homeless who live here by doubling down on the failed approaches of the past. We need a better and a different path forward.
You said there was a gentleman who lived in the bridge of the veteran, and I heard this several times in the process of this documentary that their needs were not able to be met because of whatever it was. Largely, it sounded like mental illness. What I kept wanting to hear is, what is it that they need?
Yeah. Good. That's an excellent question. We're in the process right now. We've done 6 full documentaries like this, highlighting issues, problems, shelters. The answer to your question is where we want to go next with our work. that is what that raises the question of who are the people out there that need? Green Bags, and he just extended interview, which you can see on our website. Here's the website, myroadleadshome.org. Remember that, myroadleadshome.org. You can send me an email to the website, to the contact, you can see all of our documentary work there. What we want to do next, and it's going to be a huge pivot for us, we're working on it right now, is we want to go from problems to the people being impacted by the problem to solutions to the problem. Much of what we've done has been to blast away the city. Why did it come down? Sorry, it was odd. I've been at this 15 years. Very little change. And that's kind of disturbing. Now, because of the pressure being able to bring us, we're starting to get their opinion. City council people now email me asking me, what do you think about this? What should we do about that? At least they're listening. That's the thing. What does that veteran need? He was delusional, by the way. I stopped filming him. On my golden bears. And filming him, I could tell, he was talking about the police are out there and trying to film me a number of times. The hospital trying to film the body's carried over here now. I'm going, okay, I know where I am now. But he's delusional, PTSD, a lot going on. Getting him into any shelter would be a huge task. I mean, I was filming him at night, winter outreach, which was like the end of January. And there were a lot of other people under that particular bridge at that time. And going, he's part of the community, he feels safe here. Which is why he's not in a shelter, because he doesn't feel safe. And so you've got to have an alternative that addresses his needs for safety. And the opposite where he has mental health issues. I know one of the major hospital networks here in the city of Providence is working on a street psychiatry program. 2 years ago, just as we started COVID, I was filming the beginnings of street medical. And you saw TJ Byrne under the bridge there. TJ's a friend of mine, and I've been him quite a bit. Now works out at CAS. He and Dr. Olin and Rita are working out at CAS, and they have a team. They've been doing street medical, which is great because you can spend $50 in supplies and so forth treating somebody on the street, or you can spend $5,000 by calling the ambulance and sending them to the hospital. Gee, you think you could save some money? Yeah. Well, now you have the same problem, and these people who don't get quick medical care, usually you'll send them to the emergency room, they'll be out in 3 hours with a Band-Aid and some aspirin. I'm exaggerating, but trust me, I've got enough stories. You want to know. We have the same problem with psychiatric mental health. Well, if we can't get them in to where they can get help, can we get the help out to them and begin maybe addressing some of those issues address them under a bridge? That's what we have to do. Or Trenton Waterworks, we can't hear up, and I filmed all through there. I remember one of my favorite Garth Brooks songs, I've got bridges in low places. Much of my life in homeless camps and with the river and the bridges, and these are my friends. And so when we did Shelters Not Fences, which is another piece that you'll see on our website, myroadleadshome.org. Starting to feel like Dallas Jesus is the chosen, but I won't sing it for you. I've been watching the chosen. Anyway, in Shelters Not Fences, we did a protest downtown, filmed it, and we zip tied the names of 231 people who died during 2020 and 2021. Died while. And right toward the end, you see 3 names in particular: Jerry Gaston, Jeremy Hendricks, and Doug Ponder. They were all friends. Because personal. I want to see these folks get help. Jerry Gaston was in her early 20s. When my editor and I were editing a piece on our first documentary, Spokane Homeless Connect. I saw her interview, which my crew did. I wasn't involved in the interview. I didn't see until I got the edit room and started looking at it and turned to DW, my editor, who did network editing and producing for 40 years. So DW, I put in my daughter. I mean, it was heartbreaking to see. And then when I saw her name late last year, that she died, I lost it. These are real people. So, sorry, squirrel.
When Family Promise is full and the open door is full, where do you refer families? Where do they go?
We try to get them to, we're trying to get them over to Catholic charities and their Rise and Strong program. Kudos to Catholic charities, Rob McGann, Rob McCann. They're really working hard to address homeless families, as is Family Promise. I love Joe Wader, he's a good friend of mine. When I did the second documentary that we did called The Hidden Homeless, Families Experiencing Homelessness, and I worked very closely with Joe on that piece, and then they used a segment on in their 59 minutes with Family Promise fundraiser that they did a few months back. They came to me and said, can we get from that? I said, use whatever you need, because I believe what you do. So whatever you need, yes, you have it. And so they did. When I was filming that, I went back and did an original study from scratch of homelessness in Spokane. Now, I'm not an academic anymore, and so we actually need an academic study. But what I did is I contacted all the shelter directors that I knew first. I said, send me your unduplicated membership readers, 2016, 2017, and 2018, because we were filming it, 2019. And they did. HOC, UGM, all the major shelters sent me their unduplicated numbers. Don't count the same person. And the numbers were stunning. Then I know the McKinney-Pinto liaisons who work with homeless school students. And so I called up one of them, a good friend of mine, Leslie Cannon, who was Leslie, where can I get this great information you can give us on homeless school students? And, it's all posted on the website of the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. Trying to get that in a small line. And so I went to the website, and sure enough, you can download the database. So I downloaded it. And I took a look at that and went, okay, if the student's homeless, the parent's probably homeless. 9 chances out of 10. And so what's the average family size? When did some statistical research, created an equation to account for parents and siblings. Put all this into a database, a spreadsheet. The point in time count was, I think, 1,109 on average for those 3 years. My average was 11,540. Just missed it by tenfold. Well, when I published those numbers before I released the documentary, I said the numbers out of homeless school that Kansas City called. Their homeless services department called me and said, we need to talk. Let's talk. So I went and met with the top 3 people, and they're all gone now. You lost all of your institutional knowledge when they came on board, and everybody quit. And so the people who are there now have no institutional knowledge of what has transpired over the past 5 years or whatever. That's not a good thing. That basically means they don't know what they're doing. Another story. But anyway, so I went in and reacting, being very cordial. I'm wondering, okay, when's the hammer going to fall? One of them, Keith Danzig, leaned over and told me, Maurice, we know. But all of our funding goes to the point of time, because that's where we get our funding, is to study the point of time. We don't have funding to study all of this. And I walked out of that meeting going, the city just told me I was wrong. that's why the opening segment of the Hidden Homes. If you've not seen it, you should. That segment is titled "A River of Homelessness." We have a subterranean river of homelessness that flows through Spokane. That is huge. Where is it? Occasionally shows up on street corners. The panhandle, the guy sleeping under a bridge or whatever. That's just the visible parts of it. The real river is much deeper. And it's kids couch surfing. It's families having to stay with relatives because they're also home, they're effectively home. And the kids and the family are couch surfing. When my family and I went through it, our daughter had to, she moved in with her grandparents in the Shale district because she was at Shale High. And we wanted her to be able to finish out her senior year at Shale, because the same school mom graduated from, and so there was family there, and so it was really important to her. So she got the spare bedroom at grandma's and lived with them for a year. My wife and I went to manage a Christian guest ranch outside of Deer Park, and our son had to drop out of Easter, and it changed us as a family. We became part of that river of homelessness. But we kept it to ourselves. We didn't make big announcements. We're homeless. Only do that down and that's why a lot of this river goes unnoticed, unseen. There may be homeless families in the street you don't know about. The larger the church, the more likely you're sitting, 4 seats over and 5 rows in front of somebody who's homeless. I don't want you to know that. That's not the first thing you want people to know about themselves. And so you have to be aware of it. So anyway, back to family problems. I love Joe and family problems and what they did. When I was at Knox Presbyterian Church, I was the elder there. Years ago, we worked with family problems. That was when they were running families staying in post churches, and worked with them, and they were doing that.
We were one of the churches.
Okay, cool. Well, I knew you guys have been or had been or are involved with family problems, which is great. Give them all the support you can. Other questions?
So the fellow that took over family homeless now, he's made huge strides, because we used to drive maybe 2 or 3 families, and they would be staying with us for a week, quarterly. Oh my gosh, what that guy's done, unbelievable.
Joe is incredible. I count him as a very good friend. He is a gift to this community and to families struggling with homelessness. He's creative, smart, he understands the issues. Yeah, and anytime that you spend with Joe is educational time.
Yeah, he spoke to us too.
Yeah.
He's, I doubt that he's much over 40, maybe under 40. He's a young man, but
He is.
But he's, gosh, what he's done is just unbelievable.
And he's written a book. He's still working on it because I published a kind of a galley proof for a publishing company. So that he's used it as a text up at Whitworth and a couple of other places. And when I edited the book, we took it from video to transcript, and then had to work it into book form. I got a real education from I was introducing the concepts here. For example, you'll hear this in my documentaries. And Joe will say there's no one cause of homelessness, but the 2 common denominators. I've been advocating. And I heard Joe say this, the 2 common denominators are, number 1, loss of community. That they've lost their friends, their family, their church, whatever. They've lost that community that would be a support network to get them through whatever. They don't have anybody. And then the second is deep personal trauma. For my family and I, it was financial trauma. Lost everything. We've had the experience of the sheriff driving out the driveway while you're moving, going, oh, just came to check to make sure you're going to be out by Monday. Been evicted. Had to shake hands with the sheriff, but yeah, we got it, no problem. So I understand some of the trauma. Personally. The more you look and do a deep dive in homelessness, you'll find this. You'll find somewhere in there deep personal trauma. It may be drugs. In the next segment that you're going to see on Squeeze, we'll hear an interview with Gabby Pizarro, and Gabby's a sweet. Doesn't belong on the street. She is on the street now. It's probably 2 years now. Lost a child to SIDS and fell into alcoholism, trying to deal with it, and finally her family got fired up and threw her around, wide open street. Deep personal trauma. For some people, it's drugs. For some people, it's everybody has their issues. If you've been able to deal with your issues and avoid homelessness, congratulations. Congratulations. Because I know what you missed out on, and I'm glad you missed out. But deep personal trauma, loss of community. When Joe explained those to me, I just went, why didn't I see it before? And it's amazing when somebody comes in and takes very profound truth and simplifies it and says, oh, here it is. That's a very good, knowledgeable instructor. That's who Joe is. That's what it is. And that's just one example of things that I've learned from Joe.
And we had, Adult Ed had planned on having Joe this spring come and speak to us here. And with all the different juggling of dates that we had to do, now he doesn't have a date available, but we will have him in the fall.
I've been working on convincing Joe to not travel, but rather, he's the kind of guy who could do a weekend seminar, workshop, conference, whatever you want to call it, and I'd be willing to fly across the country for this. And so I told him, you know, you've got families, you've got kids, wife, ministry, this is your hub, right? Let people come to you. Let them come, you train them and equip them and teach them. They'll go back to their churches and take that fire with them. Get a fire going in their church, then goes on. But that may take a bit for that to happen. In the meantime, do what you do right. So we'll see what happens. Anyway, other questions? Yeah.
I'm a Rotarian, and I had the pleasure of listening to Chris Patterson, who you probably know.
I've not met Chris. He emailed me with some questions. I'm working on setting up a meeting with Chris.
Very impressive man, and I wasn't aware of this, but Washington Trust Bank contacted him because they want to do something about homelessness.
Yeah.
And they contacted him, and he was about to take another job in Missouri or something. He's been in foster homes and all that before.
Yeah, his history is coming up through the foster care system.
But he's amazing. And he said that, I think that Washington Trust did this because of the lack of action by the city council. They just don't do anything.
They formed a group called Hello for Good.
I'm sorry?
Hello for Good. Downtown business owners are very frustrated with the conditions, state of homelessness downtown. It's much more, it has recently got much more violent. New drugs on the street, Nancy Blues, which is a combination of fentanyl and heroin, and they are deadly and addictive, and they're driving the drug trade in downtown Spokane right now. And the stress of the past 2 years, plus an exploding drug problem, have created some real violence. I've been warned by several people, Maurice, don't go filming in the bridges, don't go filming in the camps right now, because of that. And so I have to listen to that. I've never feared for my safety, but I'm much more cautious now. That's what's going on downtown. And there is a mentality or a worldview that says the best thing we do to solve this problem is give people two choices, jail or shelter. That's it. You're either going to a shelter or you're going to jail. And unfortunately, many in that business group, that's their view. We're going to solve this problem. The city wants to build, and most of this is out in the open now. The location is not. The city wants about a 25,000 square foot building that can house, starting with 250 beds up to 800. Because that would fulfill the grants pass, Blake versus grants pass and Martin versus Boise federal court decisions, which say you cannot enforce sit and lie or no camping if you do not have enough low barrier shelter beds to accommodate the known county homeless population. That's the kind of the bottom line. They got little nuances in there, but that's the bottom line. So if you want to enforce your no camping, no sit and lie ordinances, you've got to have shelters. Well, the city's vision is great. We will build one Mondo shelter. And we'll put all those people in it. We can now sweep them out from under the bridges, and if they say no, all right, you either go to the shelter or you go to jail, which is going to be. And that's what it will come to. Go to shelter or go to jail. The problem is you couldn't pay, I've run 4 shelters. You could not pay me to run that shelter. You want 250 to 800 chronically homeless, drug addicted, mentally challenged, go screw you people, which is how they respond when they use more colorful words than I do because it's church. You're going to put 800 of them in the building and hope nothing bad happens? No. Don't take this personally, but are you nuts? Really? That PTSD vet won't last 24 hours there. So he's going to go to your low barrier shelter that you can spend, Lord only knows how much money. He's going to wind up in jail and you're going to be paying $115 a night to keep him in jail. That's your solution. Won't work. Won't work. But that is very much part of this idea among many, and it's not just business people, community, throw me in jail, send them to jail, give me a jail. Most people haven't chosen to be homeless. They didn't choose that lifestyle. But through a series of events, that's where they are. Bad choices, good choices. Whatever happened to get them there, that's where they are. In his book that he's working on, Joe has what he calls the needs ladder. It's like 19 rungs of a ladder. And you have to climb every one of those rungs to get from homeless to stable. And throwing them in a shelter is not one of those rungs. I'm going to have to come up with something better.
With this Mondo facility being planned, are they also planning for ancillary services like mental health and medical?
I'm sure the answer is yes.
Realistically?
Don't talk to the city about what's realistic. That's an Alice in Wonderland discussion. We talk with service providers on a regular basis. And what service providers are telling us is, we're not interested. They're already, service providers right now already have a stack of cases that there is no housing, are no shelter beds. Drugs and mental health issues are off the scale right now. Shelter providers are absolutely swamped. And as a result, they're having to make promises of housing that don't exist. We're going to get you in the house 3 years from now, maybe. So service providers, in order for a shelter like that to work under ideal conditions, you've got to have mental health service providers, you've got to have drug treatment service providers. Where are the drug treatment facilities? If you were under, what's your name? Phoenix. Hi, Phoenix. If Phoenix would come to me as a service provider and say, look, I'm addicted, I'm on drugs, I hate this lifestyle, I want out, can you get me into a treatment program? Well, let me check my calendar. About 30 days from next Tuesday, would that work for me? Now, he could be dead 30 days from next Tuesday. Or, remember, you're working with a population that has no linear sense of time. Another thing that Joe thought. They live in the now. What is now? Right now, I've got to find a place to eat, I've got to find a place to sleep, I've got to find a place to pee. And I've got to get all the way across town for one appointment. When is that? I don't even remember. Oh, that appointment was last week. They have no linear sense of time. They live in the now. And they say, well, 30 days from now, might as well be 30 years on their side. By the way, that's why when they get cited, and you saw Gabby Pizarro in that film holding up the ticket she had just received by film, she'd just gotten it, for having a piece of cardboard on the sidewalk, thereby impeding pedestrian traffic. They're harassment citations is what they are. They go to community court, well, they get the citation, need to be in court 2 weeks from now in the state, and they don't show up. Why? 2 weeks? I don't know what I'm doing tonight. Don't talk to me about 2 weeks. I'll be lucky to get to today. And then there's tomorrow. I can't think further than that. So as a result, they've got out, if you don't show up for non-appearance, they issue a bench warrant for your arrest because you didn't show up. So now you've got a citation, you've got a bench warrant. Once you have a warrant outstanding, you cannot get any services. And that's assuming you haven't lost your ID. No, wait. That's why the Spokane Homeless Connect that I work with. At the Spokane Homeless Connect, we pioneered an all courts warrant fest. We get municipal court, superior court, and district court judges all show up. And you can come, and they won't arrest you unless it's something violent, really serious, criminal violent kind of thing. And you can get your warrant quashed. And they get you rescheduled. You get to talk to a prosecutor. You get to talk to a public defender, public defender's friend of mine, things friends. And you start that process all over. But now we're creating these quagmires that they've got to climb out. This is one barrier around.
So I'm just wondering, you were homeless, you lost your job, money, and everything. I guess that you weren't a drug addict. So I'm just wondering, besides, I know UGM helps people.
They do. I know the field and staff. They're great people.
Yeah. Are there other agencies that try to help people get employment and things like that?
Yeah, those are what the shelters do. Some of them, I can't remember exactly what UGM staff. I think they've got an employment person, but you've got work source or employment pipeline, or DSHS will connect you with people. Even at community point, they try to connect people with employment services and housing people. So those services are available, and any of the shelters can and doesn't because the guardians. So any guardian supporters, they don't know what they're doing. Sorry. How they got hired, God only knows. But trying to connect people with services is a big deal. But if you're going to wait for people to come into the shelter, you're going to be waiting long. As long as there are more people outside the shelter than you do in shelters. Which means you've got to have outreach workers who go out and work with people where they are. You've got to go into the camps. You've got to go under the bridges. You've got to go find these folks and find out, can you get into a shelter? Have you been banned from HOC, or have you been banned from Church Ministries, or whatever shelter is available? Right now, many shelters are available. They may have a few. HOC opened up 30 beds a couple of weeks ago. But again, a lot of these folks are, I can't go to a shelter, I can't do shelter, sorry, I can't do it. So if you're waiting for that person to come to the shelter, services, not going to happen. So you've got to be able to go out to the camp. And so we've got people like Tammy Meyer, who works with Frontier very well. I love, and I thought she's my favorite guardian. She goes out and into the camps and under the bridges and works with people. But we don't have too many like that. So I can know what they're doing. but we need more of that. So yes, shelters do try to offer services, but you can't wait for that to happen. That's correct. Okay, you need to come to an official end. Want to, my children, I'll email you.
Thank you.